In 476 AD, a barbarian chieftain walked into the throne room of the last Roman emperor and did something that would echo through history for 1,500 years. He handed him a resignation letter. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of barbarians. It didn't fall because of Christianity. It didn't even fall because of corruption. It fell because of something far more terrifying. Something that's happening to us right now. Welcome to Netflix Documentaries. I'm about to tell you the greatest story never told. How a small Italian village became the most powerful empire in human history, and why its collapse holds the key to understanding our own future.
Before we dive into this incredible journey, let me set the stage. We're going back 2,500 years to a time when the Mediterranean was a chaotic patchwork of warring tribes, Greek city-states, and emerging powers. In the center of this chaos sat a modest settlement of shepherds and farmers on 7 hills beside the Tiber River. They called it Rome. Now, here's the first question that will haunt us throughout this entire story. How did this unremarkable village grow 6,000 times its original size and increase its population by 600 times to become an empire that would define Western civilization for the next 2 millennia? But more importantly, if they were so successful, so powerful, so advanced, why did it all come crashing down? The answers to these questions will take us on a journey through betrayal, genius, brutality, and innovation. We'll meet emperors who thought they were gods, generals who conquered continents, and ordinary people who built the foundations of our modern world. But I warn you, this isn't the sanitized version you learned in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about power, ambition, and what happens when civilizations reach too far. Here's the central mystery that will drive our entire story. In 27 BC, a young man named Octavian walked into the Roman Senate and did something unprecedented. He offered to give up all his power and restore the Republic. The senators were stunned. Here was the most powerful man in the known world, voluntarily stepping down. They begged him to stay, to save Rome from chaos. He reluctantly agreed, taking the modest title Augustus, meaning the revered one. The senators cheered. The people celebrated. They thought they had saved their republic. They had no idea they had just witnessed the most brilliant political manipulation in human history. Augustus hadn't saved the republic. He had murdered it while making everyone thank him for it. But how did he do it? How did one man destroy a 500-year-old democracy and convince everyone he was their savior? And more chilling, what does this teach us about our own time? To answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand how Rome became Rome. Every empire has an origin story. Rome's is particularly insane. According to legend, Rome was founded by twin brothers raised by a wolf, who then fought to the death over who would rule their new city. The winner, Romulus, killed his brother and became the first king. Now, most historians dismiss this as mythology. But here's what's fascinating. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that something remarkably violent did happen in Rome around 753 BC, the traditional founding date. What if the myth was hiding a darker truth? What if Rome was literally born in blood? But myths aside, Rome's location was no accident. Look at this. Rome sits exactly where the Tiber River becomes navigable to the sea. but far enough inland to be protected from pirates. It's positioned perfectly to control trade between the Greek colonies in the south and the Etruscan cities in the north. The 7 hills provided natural fortification, and the surrounding plains were perfect for agriculture. It's as if someone designed the perfect location to build an empire. But here's the first circle of curiosity within our main mystery. If location was so important, why didn't the Greeks or Etruscans, who were far more advanced, build their capitals here first? To understand Rome's meteoric rise, we need to examine something that made them completely different from every other ancient power. When the Persians conquered a city, they demanded tribute and installed governors. When the Greeks conquered territory, they established colonies and treated locals as subjects. When the Egyptians expanded, they enslaved populations. Rome did something revolutionary. They offered citizenship. Think about how radical this was. A Gallic warrior who fought against Rome could, within a generation, become a Roman citizen, serve in the legions, and even hold political office in Rome itself. This wasn't just tolerance, it was strategic genius. Every conquered population had a pathway to becoming Roman. Instead of ruling over subjects, Rome was constantly growing its citizen base. But this raises a fascinating question. If integration was their secret weapon, what happened when they stopped expanding? When there were no more people to integrate? Let's talk about the Roman military, because this is where things get really interesting. Early Roman soldiers weren't professional warriors. They were citizen farmers who grabbed their spears when their city was threatened. They were regularly defeated by more experienced enemies. In 390 BC, Celtic warriors sacked Rome itself. The Romans were humiliated, forced to pay ransom to get the invaders to leave. But here's what made Romans different. They learned from every defeat. After fighting the Greeks, they adopted the phalanx formation. After battling mountain tribes, they developed more flexible manipul tactics. After facing Hannibal's genius, they revolutionized their entire strategic approach. By the 2nd century BC, the Roman legion had become the most adaptable, disciplined, and effective fighting force the world had ever seen. But the real innovation wasn't tactical, it was organizational. Romans built roads, established supply chains, and created standardized equipment production. They turned war into an industrial process. Yet this raises another troubling question. If their military was so effective, why did it eventually turn against Rome itself? To understand how Rome became a superpower, we need to examine the conflict that almost destroyed them, the Punic Wars. Carthage was everything Rome wasn't. A wealthy, sophisticated trading empire with the finest navy in the Mediterranean. When these two powers collided, it would determine the future of Western civilization. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. Rome, with virtually no naval experience, had to learn to fight at sea against the greatest maritime power of the ancient world. They did something typically Roman. They captured a Carthaginian ship, reverse-engineered it, and built a fleet. Then they invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into land battles where Roman infantry excelled. But the Second Punic War nearly ended Rome's story before it truly began. Hannibal Barca, perhaps the greatest military genius in history, crossed the Alps with elephants and devastated Roman armies for 16 years. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal didn't just defeat a Roman army, he annihilated it. 70,000 Romans died in a single day. Any other civilization would have surrendered. Rome's allies begged them to make peace. Instead, the Roman Senate issued a decree that would echo through history. Rome does not negotiate with enemies on Roman soil. They raised new armies. They changed their strategy. They learned from Hannibal's tactics and eventually used them against him. Under Scipio Africanus, Rome finally defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC. But they didn't just win. They systematically destroyed Carthage's ability to ever threaten Rome again. 50 years later, they returned and literally erased Carthage from the map, salting the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. But here's the chilling question. If Rome could show such mercy to enemies who became allies, why did they show such brutality to enemies who refused to submit? What does this tell us about the Roman character? By 146 BC, Rome had achieved something unprecedented. They had defeated every major power in the Mediterranean. They were the undisputed masters of their world. But victory came with an unexpected price. The citizen farmers who had built Rome were now professional soldiers spending decades on campaign. Their farms lay abandoned, bought up by wealthy elites using slave labor. The spoils of conquest flooded into Rome: gold, slaves, exotic goods, creating unprecedented wealth for the few and displacement for the many. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so had begun to lose its soul. And this brings us to our next circle of curiosity. How did the very success that made Rome great also plant the seeds of its destruction? In 133 BC, a young Roman aristocrat named Tiberius Gracchus stood before the popular assembly with a radical proposal that would shatter the Roman Republic forever. He wanted to redistribute land from the wealthy to the poor. Sounds reasonable, right? Land reform had been done before. But here's what made this different. Tiberius bypassed the Senate entirely. He went straight to the people. The Senate was furious. They declared his actions illegal. When Tiberius ran for re-election to continue his reforms, a mob of senators and their supporters beat him to death with clubs and chair legs in the forum. For the first time in Roman history, political disagreement had led to murder in the heart of the city. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius tried to continue the reforms. He met the same fate. But here's the terrifying question. If the Roman system was so stable, so successful, why did land reform lead to civil war? What had changed? The answer lies with a general named Gaius Marius, who made a decision that seemed logical at the time, but would ultimately destroy the Republic. Rome's armies were traditionally made up of property-owning citizens who could afford their own equipment. But by 100 BC, most Roman citizens were too poor to qualify for military service. Rome needed soldiers for its expanding wars, but the traditional recruitment pool had dried up. Marius's solution was brilliant and catastrophic. He opened military service to everyone, regardless of property. The state would provide equipment, training, and most importantly, land grants upon retirement. Suddenly, Rome had professional armies of men whose loyalty wasn't to the Republic, but to the general who would secure their retirement. But this raises a chilling question. What happens when these professional armies start competing with each other? When generals realize they command more power than the state itself? We didn't have to wait long for an answer. In 88 BC, two Roman generals, Marius and Sulla, both claimed the right to command a war against King Mithridates. When the Senate awarded the command to Sulla, but the popular assembly gave it to Marius, Sulla made a decision that shattered every tradition of Roman governance. He marched his legions on Rome itself. For the first time in Roman history, Roman soldiers occupied their own capital. Sulla seized control, eliminated his enemies, and marched off to his war. But when he returned, he did something even more shocking. He posted lists of enemies of the state in the forum. Anyone on these lists could be killed by anyone, with the killer receiving a reward. Thousands died. Property was confiscated. Terror ruled Rome. Then, in 79 BC, Sulla did something unprecedented. He voluntarily gave up power and retired to his villa. But the precedent was set. Roman armies could march on Rome. Political enemies could be eliminated en masse. The Republic's rules were just suggestions. By 60 BC, 3 men dominated Roman politics: Pompey the Great, the richest man in Rome, Marcus Crassus, and a rising politician named Julius Caesar. In a private meeting that would change history, these 3 made a deal. They would pool their resources and influence to control Roman politics. They called it the First Triumvirate, 3 men ruling a republic of millions. Pompey got ratification of his eastern conquests. Crassus got lucrative contracts and eventually a military command. Caesar got the consulship and then the governorship of Gaul. For Caesar, Gaul was perfect, a chance to build his own army, win glory, and accumulate the wealth needed to compete with his partners. Over 8 years, Caesar conquered all of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain. He enslaved over 1 million people and killed another 1 million. He sent detailed reports back to Rome, making himself the most famous man in the Republic. But here's the crucial question. What happens when the partnership breaks down? When 3 men who carved up the Republic between them start competing for the whole prize? In 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River with a single legion, facing the most important decision in Roman history. The triumvirate had collapsed. Crassus was dead, killed fighting the Parthians. Pompey had aligned with the Senate against Caesar. The Senate had given Caesar an ultimatum: dismiss his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen to face charges, or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar knew that returning without his armies meant political destruction and probably death. But crossing the Rubicon with armed forces meant civil war. According to legend, Caesar paused at the riverbank and said, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. With those words, he crossed the river and plunged Rome into a civil war that would last, on and off, for the next 13 years. But here's what's truly terrifying about this moment. Caesar didn't cross the Rubicon to destroy the Republic. He crossed it to save his own life. The Republic was already so broken that its greatest general had no choice but to become its enemy. By 44 BC, Julius Caesar had won the civil war, defeated Pompey, and become dictator of Rome. He had reformed the calendar, expanded citizenship, and launched massive public works projects. But a group of senators led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius believed Caesar had gone too far. They'd called themselves the Liberators. Their mission: assassinate Caesar and restore the Republic. On March 15, 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate House despite warnings from soothsayers and his wife's prophetic dreams. As he took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition. 23 stab wounds later, Julius Caesar lay dead at the foot of Pompey's statue. The liberators expected the Roman people to rejoice. Instead, they were met with horror and rage. At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony read his will. Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen and donated his private gardens to the city. The crowd went wild. They cremated Caesar's body in the Forum and hunted the assassins through the streets. The liberators had killed Caesar to save the Republic. Instead, they had guaranteed its destruction. But how? How did murder lead to empire? Caesar's assassination didn't restore the Republic. It triggered the final, most devastating phase of Roman civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, joined forces with Marcus Lepidus and Caesar's adopted heir, an 18-year-old named Octavian. Unlike the secret First Triumvirate, this partnership was official and brutal. They divided the Roman world between them and published new proscription lists. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and defender of the Republic, was hunted down and killed. His head and hands were nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum. The Republic that had survived Hannibal, conquered the Mediterranean, and lasted 500 years was drowning in the blood of its own citizens. But from this chaos would emerge one man who would end the civil wars forever, not by restoring the Republic, but by creating something entirely new, something that would last for 1,500 years. And this brings us back to our central mystery. How did Augustus convince everyone he was saving the Republic while actually destroying it?
Before we solve this mystery and discover how Augustus pulled off the greatest political con in history, I need to ask you something. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, please hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible stories from history. And if you want to explore more untold stories that will change how you see the world, subscribe to Netflix Documentaries and ring that notification bell. We're building a community of curious minds who want to understand how the past shapes our present. Now, let's discover how one young man outsmarted the entire Roman establishment and created an empire that would define civilization for the next millennium and a half.
When Julius Caesar was assassinated, his adopted heir Octavian was just 18 years old, a sickly teenager with no military experience, no political connections, and no obvious qualifications for power. His main rival, Mark Antony, was a seasoned general, a gifted orator, and Caesar's trusted lieutenant. By every measure, Antony should have inherited Caesar's mantle. Yet within 13 years, Octavian had defeated Antony, conquered Egypt, and become the first Roman emperor. How did he do it? How did a teenager with no advantages outmaneuver the most powerful people in the world? The answer lies in something we'd recognize today. Octavian was a master of propaganda and public relations. While Antony was fighting wars and making alliances, Octavian was carefully crafting his image. He presented himself as Caesar's rightful heir, the defender of Roman traditions, and the protector of the Republic. When Antony formed an alliance with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, Octavian turned it into a public relations disaster. He didn't attack Antony directly. That would have looked like civil war. Instead, he declared war on Cleopatra, painting Antony as a Roman general seduced by a foreign queen. Antony has abandoned Rome for Egypt, Octavian proclaimed. He's become a puppet of an Oriental despot who wants to rule over free Romans. It was brilliant. When Roman forces finally clashed at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, it wasn't civil war. It was Rome defending itself against foreign invasion. But here's the fascinating question. If Octavian was such a master manipulator, how do we know his version of events is true? What if Antony wasn't the villain? What if we've been believing Octavian's propaganda for 2,000 years? In 27 BC, Octavian walked into the Roman Senate and delivered the speech that would define the next 1,500 years of European history. "Senators," he said, "the Republic has been restored. The civil wars are over. I return all power to the Senate." And people of Rome, the senators, were stunned. Here was the most powerful man in the world voluntarily giving up absolute power. They panicked. "Please," they begged, "stay and guide us. Rome needs your leadership." After much theatrical reluctance, Octavian agreed to accept certain responsibilities: command of the armies, governance of the frontier provinces, authority over foreign policy. He took the modest title Augustus, meaning the revered one, and insisted he was merely the first citizen of a restored republic. It was the perfect lie. Augustus had kept all the real power while giving the Senate the illusion of restored authority. The republic was dead, but everyone could pretend it still existed. But this raises a crucial question: if Augustus was lying, why did it work? Why did the Roman people accept this obvious fiction? To understand why Romans embraced Augustus's restored republic, we need to grasp just how devastating the civil wars had been. For 13 years, Roman armies had fought Roman armies across 3 continents. Entire generations of young men had been wiped out. The economy was shattered. Trade had collapsed. Pirates ruled the Mediterranean. Bandits controlled the roads. Romans were exhausted, traumatized, and desperate for stability. Augustus gave them exactly what they craved: peace, prosperity, and order. He rebuilt roads, cleared pirates from the seas, established secure borders, and created a professional civil service. For the first time in decades, Romans could travel safely, trade freely, and plan for the future. Most importantly, he ended the cycle of civil war. No more armies marching on Rome. No more prescription lists. No more political murders. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Augustus succeeded because Romans were willing to trade their freedom for security. Sound familiar? Augustus understood something that modern politicians would recognize. Controlling culture is more powerful than controlling armies. He commissioned Virgil to write the Aeneid, an epic poem that made Rome's imperial destiny seem divinely ordained. He funded historians like Livy, who portrayed the Republic's collapse as inevitable and Augustus's rise as salvation. He built monuments that told the story he wanted told: the Areopagus celebrating peace, the Forum of Augustus honoring Roman heroes. Most brilliantly, he created a new calendar of festivals and celebrations that made imperial rule feel traditional and natural. Within a generation, Romans couldn't imagine life without an emperor. The Republic became ancient history. But this cultural transformation raises a disturbing question. If Augustus could rewrite history and reshape culture so completely, how much of what we know about Rome is actually imperial propaganda? There was one problem Augustus never solved: succession. The Republic had never needed rules for transferring power because officials served short terms. But Augustus had created a system that depended on one man ruling for life. His chosen heirs kept dying. His grandsons Gaius and Lucius died young. His nephew Marcellus died of illness. His stepson Drusus died in a campaign. Finally, Augustus was forced to adopt his stepson Tiberius, a brilliant general who had no interest in ruling and openly despised the political system. When Augustus died in 14 AD, he left behind an empire that had no constitutional method for choosing new emperors. Power would pass to whoever could control the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and the armies, a recipe for civil war. And this brings us to a chilling realization. Augustus's system worked perfectly, as long as Augustus was alive. But what happens when the man who holds the system together is gone? By the time Augustus died, he had achieved something unprecedented in human history. He had created a stable, prosperous empire spanning 3 continents and lasting for centuries. Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman culture, and Roman peace had transformed the Mediterranean world. A merchant could travel from Britain to Syria using Roman roads, Roman currency, and Roman law. A scholar could study in Athens, teach in Alexandria, and retire in Rome. Augustus had ended the chaos of the Republic and created the foundation for Western civilization. But the price was freedom. Romans had traded their right to choose their leaders for peace and prosperity. They had accepted that one man and his family would rule them forever, as long as that rule brought stability. The question that would haunt the next 400 years was simple. What happens when that one man is incompetent, insane, or evil? In 37 AD, just 23 years after Augustus's death, a 24-year-old named Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, became emperor of Rome. The people loved him. He was the son of the beloved general Germanicus, and he promised to restore the Senate's power and end his predecessor Tiberius's harsh rule. For the first few months, he was everything Romans hoped for: generous, accessible, and respectful of tradition. Then something changed. Caligula began appearing in public dressed as various gods. He built a bridge across the Bay of Naples, just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. He made his horse Incitatus a consul. He declared war on Neptune and ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of victory. Most infamously, he turned public executions into entertainment, forcing parents to watch their children die and smile while doing it. But here's the terrifying question: how did the most powerful empire in history end up ruled by a madman? And more importantly, why couldn't anyone stop him? To understand how Rome got stuck with Caligula, we need to examine the fatal flaw in Augustus's system. Augustus had concentrated all real power in the emperor while maintaining the fiction of republican government. But this created a dangerous situation. The Senate had prestige but no authority. They could debate, but the emperor decided. The emperor commanded the armies, controlled the treasury, and appointed all governors. There were no checks, no balances, no way to remove a bad ruler. When Caligula started acting insane, there was no constitutional method to stop him. The only solution was murder, and that's exactly what happened. In 41 AD, Praetorian guards stabbed Caligula to death in a palace corridor. They found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain and made him emperor on the spot. But this set a terrifying precedent. The Praetorian Guard could make and unmake emperors. Rome's rulers now served at the pleasure of their own bodyguards. In 54 AD, Rome got another young emperor, 16-year-old Nero, tutored by the philosopher Seneca and guided by the Praetorian prefect Burrus. Initially, Nero seemed promising. He was intelligent, artistic, and showed interest in governing well. His first 5 years were so successful that historians called them the Quinquennium Neronis, the golden 5 years of Nero. But as Nero matured, his priorities shifted from governing to performing. He became obsessed with being a performer, singing, acting, and racing chariots in public competitions. To Roman aristocrats, this was scandalous. Emperors were supposed to maintain dignity, not compete with actors and athletes. As criticism mounted, Nero became paranoid and violent. He murdered his mother Agrippina, his wife Octavia, and eventually his mentor Seneca. When the Great Fire devastated Rome in 64 AD, rumors spread that Nero had started it to clear land for his massive palace complex, the Domus Aurea. Whether true or not, Nero used the fire as an excuse to build a palace so enormous it covered a third of the city. He blamed the fire on a new religious sect, the Christians, and turned their persecution into public entertainment. But here's what's fascinating. Despite his excesses, Nero remained popular with ordinary Romans. Why? What did they see that the aristocrats didn't? To understand Nero's popularity, we need to see him through the eyes of ordinary Romans, not aristocratic historians. Nero gave the people spectacular entertainment, gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical performances, and public festivals. His massive building projects provided employment for thousands of workers. He reduced taxes, provided free grain distributions, and showed genuine concern for the common people. While senators complained about his undignified behavior, Romans saw an emperor who cared about their entertainment and welfare. His performances, scandalous to the elite, showed ordinary Romans that their emperor was talented and accessible. This created a dangerous disconnect. The emperor was popular with the masses but hated by the elite who actually held power. In 68 AD, military commanders in Gaul and Spain declared rebellion, not because Nero was unpopular, but because he had lost the support of the army and aristocracy. Facing certain defeat, Nero committed suicide, allegedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." But his death triggered something unprecedented, the year of the 4 emperors, when Rome had 4 different rulers in a single year. What does this tell us about the stability of the imperial system? Nero's death in 68 AD exposed the fundamental weakness of the imperial system. With no constitutional succession, power went to whoever could command the most legions. First came Galba, the elderly governor of Spain, supported by his legions, and the Praetorian Guard. But Galba was a miser who refused to pay the bonuses soldiers expected from a new emperor. After just 7 months, he was murdered by supporters of Otho, who had the backing of the Praetorian Guard. But Otho faced a challenge from Vitellius, whose German legions were already marching on Rome. At the Battle of Bedriacum, Otho's forces were defeated. Rather than continue the civil war, Otho committed suicide after just 95 days as emperor. Vitellius seemed secure, but he faced an unexpected challenger, Vespasian, commanding the legions fighting the Jewish revolt. The eastern armies declared for Vespasian, and his supporters captured Rome while Vitellius was still celebrating his victory. Vitellius was killed, and Vespasian became the 4th emperor in a single year. But here's the crucial lesson. The year of the 4 emperors showed that the Pax Romana was only as stable as the emperor who maintained it. When succession failed, the entire system collapsed into chaos. Vespasian learned from the chaos of 68 to 69 AD To prevent future succession crises, he did something revolutionary. He made the imperial succession explicitly hereditary. Unlike Augustus, who maintained the fiction of republican selection, Vespasian openly prepared his sons Titus and Domitian to succeed him. He also understood the need to legitimize his rule through spectacular public works, most famously the Colosseum. When Titus succeeded his father in 79 AD, the transition was smooth and accepted. Titus ruled for just 2 years, but was beloved for his response to disasters, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and a fire in Rome. When Titus died unexpectedly, his younger brother Domitian took power without opposition. But Domitian was different. Paranoid, authoritarian, and convinced that everyone was plotting against him. He executed senators on the slightest suspicion of treason and ruled through fear and intimidation. In 96 AD, he was assassinated by his own servants in a palace conspiracy. Once again, the only solution to a bad emperor was murder. But this raises a fundamental question. If even good dynasties like the Flavians produced tyrants, was there something inherently wrong with the imperial system? The first century of imperial rule revealed a fundamental paradox. The system that brought Rome unprecedented peace and prosperity was also capable of producing unprecedented tyranny. Under good emperors like Augustus, Vespasian, and Titus, the empire flourished. Cities grew, trade expanded, and culture thrived. Under bad emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Domitian, the same system produced terror, waste, and instability. The problem was structural. There were no institutional safeguards against imperial abuse of power. The empire's fate depended entirely on the character of one man, chosen by accident of birth or force of arms. Romans had traded their freedom for security, but they had no guarantee that security would continue. But what if there was a way to get the benefits of imperial rule without the risks? What if you could systematically choose good emperors? The answer to this question would produce Rome's greatest age and its most dangerous precedent. In 96 AD, after Domitian's assassination, the Roman Senate faced a crisis. They needed an emperor who could restore stability, but they were terrified of choosing another tyrant. Their solution was unprecedented. They chose one of their own, the 66-year-old senator Marcus Cocceius Nerva. Nerva was respected, experienced, and most importantly, old. He wouldn't rule long enough to become a tyrant. But Nerva faced immediate problems. The Praetorian Guard, who had supported Domitian, resented the new emperor and demanded he execute Domitian's assassins. Worse, the frontier armies, loyal to the Flavian dynasty, threatened rebellion. Nerva's solution was genius. He adopted the most popular and capable general in the empire as his son and heir. Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, Trajan, was commanding the armies on the Rhine frontier. He was respected by the soldiers, experienced in government, and crucially, had no connection to the old imperial families. In a public ceremony, Nerva declared Trajan his adopted son and chosen successor. The effect was immediate. The armies accepted the new dynasty, the Praetorian Guard backed down, and Rome had its first peaceful transition of power in decades. When Nerva died in 98 AD, Trajan became emperor without opposition. But here's what made this revolutionary. Nerva had proven that emperors could choose their successors based on merit rather than birth. What would happen if this became the standard? Could Rome finally solve the succession problem? Trajan was everything Nerva had hoped for and more. A brilliant general, an effective administrator, and a ruler who understood both the needs of the army and the desires of the people. In Rome, he launched massive public works projects. Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Market, and Trajan's Column, which still stands today. But Trajan's true genius lay in expansion. He was the last emperor to significantly increase the size of the Roman Empire. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, adding vast gold mines that funded his building projects. Then he turned east, conquering Armenia, Mesopotamia, and briefly reaching the Persian Gulf. At its height under Trajan, in 116 AD, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. But Trajan understood something crucial. Conquest alone wasn't enough. He needed to integrate new territories and peoples into the Roman system. He built roads, established cities, granted citizenship, and created opportunities for local elites to join the imperial administration. But here's the fascinating question. If Trajan was so successful at expansion, why did his successors stop conquering? What changed? When Trajan died in 117 AD, his adopted son, Hadrian, made a shocking decision. He abandoned most of Trajan's eastern conquests. Hadrian pulled Roman forces back from Mesopotamia and Armenia, consolidating the empire's borders at more defensible positions. Instead of conquest, Hadrian focused on consolidation. He spent more than half his reign traveling the empire, inspecting defenses, and improving administration. His most famous legacy is Hadrian's Wall, 73 miles of fortification across northern Britain that marked the empire's permanent northern boundary. But the wall was more than military engineering. It was a statement. Rome was no longer expanding. The age of conquest was over. Hadrian redirected imperial resources from military expansion to internal development, cities, roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, founded the city of Antinopolis in Egypt, and established schools throughout the empire. Under his rule, Roman culture reached new heights of sophistication and refinement. But Hadrian also faced the empire's most serious internal challenge, the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from 132 to 136 AD. The rebellion was suppressed with characteristic Roman brutality. Entire populations were enslaved or killed, and Judea was renamed Syria-Palestina to erase Jewish identity. This raises a disturbing question. If the empire was no longer expanding, how would Rome maintain the military culture that had made it great? What happens to a warrior society when there are no more wars to fight? Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, ruled for 23 years and barely left Italy. He was the most sedentary emperor in Roman history, governing the vast empire from his desk in Rome. Under Antoninus, the empire experienced unprecedented peace and prosperity. There were no major wars, no significant rebellions, no political crises. Trade flourished, cities grew, and the population reached its historical peak. Antoninus focused on legal reform, improving the rights of slaves and gladiators, and creating more humane laws. Art, literature, and philosophy thrived in an atmosphere of stability and security. It was perhaps the most peaceful period in human history, a time when millions of people lived their entire lives without experiencing war. But underneath this peaceful surface, problems were developing that would eventually destroy the empire. Without the wealth from new conquests, the imperial economy began to stagnate. The army, with no wars to fight, grew soft and less effective. On the frontiers, barbarian tribes were organizing and growing stronger. When Antoninus died in 161 AD, he left his successor an empire that was peaceful and prosperous, but also complacent and unprepared for the challenges ahead. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, was perhaps the most unlikely ruler in Roman history, a philosopher who never wanted to be emperor. Trained in Stoic philosophy, Marcus believed in duty, virtue, and acceptance of fate. When Antoninus adopted him as heir, Marcus accepted the responsibility as a philosophical duty, not a personal ambition. But Marcus's reign was marked by crisis from the beginning. A devastating plague, possibly smallpox, swept through the empire, killing millions. Then came military disasters. Germanic tribes crossed the Danube, invading the empire's heartland for the first time in centuries. Marcus, who had never wanted to be a warrior, spent most of his reign fighting wars on the northern frontier. The Punic Wars lasted from 166 to 180 AD, draining the imperial treasury and exhausting the army. It was during these campaigns that Marcus wrote his philosophical masterpiece, the Meditations, Reflections on Duty, Mortality, and the Burden of Power. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength, he wrote. But even Marcus faced internal challenges, the rebellion of Avidius. Cassius in 175 AD showed that even the most virtuous emperor could face betrayal. Marcus's response was characteristically philosophical. He pardoned the rebels and sought to understand why they had rebelled. But Marcus made a decision that would haunt the empire. Unlike his predecessors, he didn't adopt an heir based on merit. Instead, he chose his biological son, Commodus. Marcus Aurelius faced an impossible choice: continue the adoption system that had given Rome its greatest emperors, or pass power to his natural son. As a philosopher, Marcus believed in merit over birth. As a father, he loved his son. But Commodus was already showing disturbing traits. He was violent, self-indulgent, and more interested in gladiatorial combat than governance. Marcus's advisors warned against making Commodus heir, but Marcus feared that passing over his son would trigger a civil war. In 177 AD, Marcus made Commodus co-emperor, effectively ending the adoption system. When Marcus died in 180 AD, Commodus became sole emperor at age 18. Within months, Commodus had abandoned the northern wars, returned to Rome, and begun the reign of terror that would end the Golden Age. With that decision, Marcus Aurelius, the most philosophical and virtuous of emperors, destroyed the system that had made Rome great. The 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, gave Rome its greatest century. From 96 to 180 AD, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, its peak population, and its highest level of prosperity. They built monuments that still inspire us, created laws that still influence us, and established a peace that wouldn't be matched for over a millennium. They proved that merit-based succession could work, that emperors chosen for their ability, rather than their birth, could govern effectively. But they also revealed the system's fatal weakness. It depended entirely on each emperor having the wisdom and strength to choose his successor based on merit, rather than sentiment. When Marcus Aurelius chose love over logic, blood over merit, he condemned the empire to return to the chaos of hereditary succession. The Golden Age was ending, and with it, Rome's last chance to solve the fundamental problem of imperial succession. What followed would test whether the empire Augustus built could survive its own contradictions. On New Year's Day, 193 A.D., something unprecedented happened in the Colosseum. The Emperor of Rome stepped into the arena as a gladiator. Commodus didn't just watch the games from the imperial box like his predecessors. He fought in them, convinced. He was the reincarnation of Hercules. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months of the year after his titles. He appeared in public wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club. While the emperor played gladiator, the empire was falling apart. He sold government positions to the highest bidder, ignored frontier defenses, and emptied the imperial treasury on games and personal luxuries. By 192 A.D., even his closest advisors had had enough. On December 31st, 192 A.D., Commodus was strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner, ending the Antonine dynasty. But here's the terrifying question. If the son of Marcus Aurelius, raised in the imperial palace and trained from birth to rule, could become such a monster, what did that say about the imperial system itself? Commodus's assassination in 192 A.D. triggered a crisis that nearly destroyed the Roman Empire forever. In 193 A.D., 5 different men claimed to be emperor, each supported by different armies. For the next 50 years, the empire was racked by almost continuous civil war. Between 235 and 284 A.D., just 49 years, there were 50 different emperors. Most died violent deaths. While Romans fought Romans, barbarian tribes poured across the frontiers. The Alemanni reached northern Italy. The Goths sacked Athens. The Franks raided Gaul and Spain. In the east, the Persian Empire captured Roman territories and even took an emperor prisoner. The economy collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Trade networks broke down. Plague and warfare decimated the population. Some regions lost half their inhabitants. The empire literally broke apart. Gaul and Britain formed the independent Gallic Empire, while the eastern provinces created the Palmyrene Empire. For a moment in the 270s, there wasn't one Roman Empire. There were 3, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to Augustus. In 284 AD, a general named Diocletian became emperor and made a shocking realization. The Roman Empire was too big for one man to rule. Diocletian saw that the empire's problems were structural, not personal. The system Augustus had created 300 years earlier no longer worked. His solution was radical: divide the empire among 4 rulers, the Tetrarchy. 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars, would share power, with each responsible for defending specific regions. But Diocletian went further. He completely reorganized the army, separated civil and military commands, and established a new capital in the east, Nicomedia. He attempted to control inflation with price controls and created a new tax system based on land and population rather than money. Most controversially, he launched the last and most severe persecution of Christians, seeing their growing influence as a threat to traditional Roman values. In 305 AD, Diocletian did something unprecedented. he voluntarily retired, becoming the first emperor since Augustus to give up power and live. But within a year of his retirement, the tetrarchy collapsed into civil war. From this chaos would emerge one man who would transform the Roman Empire more radically than anyone since Augustus, Constantine the Great. In 312 AD, Constantine was just one of several claimants to imperial power, preparing to fight his rival Maxentus at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. According to legend, the night before the battle, Constantine had a vision. He saw the Christian symbol Chi-Rho in the sky with the words in this sign, "Conquer." Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields and banners. The next day, he won a decisive victory, becoming sole emperor of the Western Empire. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the empire. Within a generation, Christianity went from being a persecuted minority to the favored religion of the imperial court. Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to resolve theological disputes, making the emperor the effective head of the Christian Church. But Constantine's most lasting change was founding a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of ancient Byzantium. This new Rome was designed from the ground up as a Christian city, free from the pagan associations of old Rome. For the first time since Augustus, the empire's center of gravity shifted away from Rome itself. But Constantine's transformation raised a fundamental question. Was this still the Roman Empire, or had it become something entirely new? By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire faced a new reality. There weren't enough Romans to defend Roman borders. Plague, warfare, and economic decline had decimated the population. The citizen soldiers who had built the empire were gone. Rome's solution was to recruit entire barbarian tribes as foederati, allied forces who served in exchange for land and payment. Gothic, Frankish, and Vandal warriors filled the ranks of Roman armies, often commanded by their own chiefs. By 400 AD, many of Rome's top generals were barbarians. Stilicho the Vandal, Alaric the Goth, Attila's rival Aetius. This created a complex situation. Barbarian allies defended Roman territory while maintaining their own customs and loyalties. The line between Roman and barbarian, ally and enemy, became increasingly blurred. When payment was delayed or agreements broken, allies could quickly become invaders, as happened when Alaric the Goth sacked Rome in 410 AD. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves through the empire. The Eternal City, unconquered for 800 years, had fallen to barbarians. Christian thinkers like Augustine struggled to explain how God could allow the Christian empire to suffer such humiliation. But the sack of Rome revealed a new reality. The barbarians weren't trying to destroy the empire. They wanted to join it, to become Romans themselves. The question was whether there was still a Roman Empire for them to join. By 395 AD, the Roman Empire had been permanently divided into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor. The Western Emperor ruled from Ravenna, not Rome, which had become too dangerous and irrelevant. The Eastern Emperor ruled from Constantinople, which was becoming the real center of Roman power. The two halves faced different challenges. The West dealt with barbarian invasions and economic collapse, while the East faced Persian wars and religious disputes. Initially, the two emperors cooperated, but increasingly they competed, sometimes even allying with barbarians against each other. When the Vandals conquered North Africa in 429 to 439 AD, they cut off the Western Empire's main source of grain and tax revenue. The Western Empire was slowly starving, unable to pay its armies or maintain its infrastructure. The arrival of Attila the Hun in the 440s created a crisis that required both empires to cooperate, but also revealed their growing differences. At the Battle of Chalons in 451 AD, a combined Roman barbarian army defeated Attila, but the Roman army was mostly Germanic allies. By the mid-5th century, it was unclear what Roman even meant. Were the Germanic foederati Romans? Were the Eastern and Western empires the same state? Was the empire evolving or dying? By 450 AD, the Roman Empire bore little resemblance to the state Augustus had created. It was Christian rather than pagan, bureaucratic rather than military, Eastern rather than Western. Its armies were filled with barbarians. Its culture was influenced by Germanic customs, and its borders were fluid rather than fixed. The simple imperial system had become a complex web of competing authorities, emperors, generals, bishops, and barbarian kings. The money economy was giving way to barter, cities were shrinking, and long-distance trade was declining. Yet Roman law still governed, Latin was still spoken, and the idea of Rome still commanded loyalty. The empire was transforming rather than simply declining, but that transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's control. And this brings us to our final question. When the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 AD, was it the end of the Roman Empire or just another transformation in its long evolution? So we return to where we began 476 AD, when the barbarian chieftain Odoacer walked into the throne room of the last Roman emperor and handed him a resignation letter. But here's the shocking truth. Odoacer didn't destroy the Roman Empire. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and declared himself king of Italy under the authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor. In other words, he was trying to preserve Roman authority, not destroy it. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years. Emperor Justinian reconquered Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain in the 6th century. The Byzantine Empire called itself Roman until 1453 AD, nearly 1,000 years after the supposed fall of Rome. In the West, Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor in 800 AD, creating the Holy Roman Empire that lasted until 1806. When Constantinople fell, Moscow declared itself the Third Rome, and Russian Tsars, Caesars, claimed Roman succession until 1917. Our legal systems, our languages, our architecture, our political concepts, they're all Roman. So here's the answer to our central mystery. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians, Christianity, or corruption. Rome never fell at all. It transformed, evolved, and continues to shape our world today. But what does Rome's story teach us about our own time? Like Rome, we face the tension between freedom and security, between diversity and unity, between expansion and sustainability. Like Rome, we struggle with how to choose leaders, how to transfer power peacefully, and how to prevent the concentration of authority. Like Rome, we see growing inequality, the decline of the middle class, and the rise of populist leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. Like Rome, we debate the role of military force in civilian society and the balance between national security and individual rights. Like Rome, we face questions about immigration, integration, and what it means to be a citizen in a diverse society. Rome's story reminds us that these aren't new problems. They're the eternal challenges of civilization itself. Augustus convinced Romans to trade their freedom for security by making them believe they were saving their republic while actually destroying it. Every generation faces leaders who promise to restore the past while actually creating something new. The question isn't whether this will happen, it's whether we'll recognize it when it does. Rome's greatest lesson isn't about the past, it's about the future. The empire that began with shepherds on 7 hills became the foundation of Western civilization. And that story isn't over. It's still being written in every democracy that struggles with the balance of power, in every society that debates the meaning of citizenship, in every generation that must choose between freedom and security. We are all Romans now. The question is, what kind of Romans will we choose to be?
The story of Rome connects directly to another great civilization that has been almost completely forgotten by history. The Indus Valley civilization was larger than Rome and Egypt combined, yet we know almost nothing about them. They had advanced cities, sophisticated technology, and a writing system we still can't decode, but they vanished without a trace, leaving behind one of history's greatest mysteries. Click the link on screen to discover the Forgotten Empire. That might have changed everything if we could only understand what happened to them. And don't forget to subscribe to Netflix Documentaries for more stories that will change how you see the world. Until next time, keep questioning everything you think you know about history.